Today we're going to take a look at the form and structure classes. So we're back to Unit 1, going old school, laying the foundation. And our essential question is how do the form and structure classes produce the 10 sentence patterns? So this will be probably the first time we start using some terminology that you may not necessarily be familiar with. So we're going to talk about the vocabulary of grammar. So we're actually going to move away from this traditional 8 parts of speech, which I think we've been taught through all these years of school, which is a very Latin way of understanding language. And we're going to take a look at how we look at a language a little differently by classifying our words into what we call form and structure classes. Now, those 8 parts of speech, those terms will still show up, but then there'll be like other terms you've never heard of before. You're like, okay, I didn't realize that was something that I have to be aware of. So we're going to take on the vocabulary of grammar. So in this video, we're going to focus solely on the form classes, and then we'll do a second video on what we call the structure classes. So the form classes, oftentimes referred to as the open classes, are actually 99% of our vocabulary are made up of these words. And we call them form classes because they change their form. And that's one way of identifying them. Another reason we call them open classes is because the it's almost like a country club and the gates are open, like membership is open, like we're constantly creating new adjectives and new nouns and new verbs and sometimes new adverbs as well, but not as much as the other three. So as we go through these notes, I would encourage you to write down what you need to write down, but I wouldn't write down something that's pretty easy to you. If you know what a verb is, why waste your time writing down notes that you already know what a verb is? Anyway, you're going to notice that I'm not going to give definitions, but I'm going to give you examples of how this word changes form. It's almost as if I were learning the language for the first time. How do I really know something's a verb? As opposed to saying, well, it's an action. Let's just look at what the word does. So a verb has both a base form and an S form. So I could say bark and barks, play and plays, drive drives, buy and buys. So that's one way that the verb changes its form. It also has what we call an ed and an en form. So barked and barked, which sounds kind of silly, but barked, barked, the second barked is also its en form. Not every word literally takes an en. There are some irregular words, and so barked is also the ed and the en form. Played and played is another example. Drove and driven. Well, drove doesn't have an ed to it, but that's the ed form of drive, and driven is the en form. Bought and bought. Once again, the taking the word buy and changing it to bought, and then the en form is also bought. So we call them the ed and the en form, but they don't always literally have those two endings. Verbs also have ing forms: barking, playing, driving, buying. So we realize that when the word changes its form and it's able to actually transform into all those different forms, we're probably dealing with a verb. Another main thing I want you to make sure you know is that a verb phrase is the verb head word and all the modifiers and all the adverbials around it which describe it. So if I said mysteriously disappeared from her Scooby Doo lunchbox, that's a big verb phrase. Mysteriously is in front of it from her Scooby Doo lunchbox, which is technically a prep phrase, but it's all basically describing that head word disappeared. Or on her way to school had stopped for a pumpkin spice latte at Starbucks. Well, stopped is the head word. It has a little helper had and has these prep phrases in front, and has prep phrases behind. All that combines to create what we call the verb phrase. On weekends, competes at Wii bowling tournaments with his grandma and her friends at the retirement community. Once again, I want you to see there's an individual verb. There are a lot of words all around it, which are all basically modifying that verb. Secondly, we have nouns. And so instead of giving you a definition of a noun, let's simply take a look at how a noun changes its form to say, oh, I think that word is now a noun. So a noun has both a singular and a plural form. We can say hippie and hippies, monkey and monkeys, woman and women, pizza and pizzas. We notice that not every noun is going to literally take an S in order for it to be plural. They also have possessive forms. So both singular and plural possessive. The hippie's van, hippie's tattoos, monkey's owner, monkey's bow ties, woman's shoes, women's rights, pizza's aroma, pizza's toppings. We'll eventually get into apostrophes, but once again, something that we notice as linguists about nouns is the fact that they have possessive forms. Nouns are often marked or signaled by what we call articles and other determiners. So a determiner is actually the bigger category, and an article is going to slide in there. And we'll get to that when we get to the structure classes. Just know when we come across these kind of words like a monkey or that woman or my pet or some people, those are trigger words or signal words that a noun is going to show up. And just like a verb phrase, we have noun phrases where we have the noun head word, the main noun. We have modifiers or what we call adjectivals all around it. The welcoming smell of morning coffee. Smell is your single most important noun in that grouping. Everything else is is basically describing that word smell, both in front and behind. Grandpa's unsightly goiter on the side of his neck. Goiter is the main noun. Everything else around it's describing goiter. Rabbi Steve. Even some kind of like a mister or a doctor, in this case, rabbi, is not really part of that noun, Steve, but it's a modifier for that noun. Our grammar teacher with the inexplicable passion for NASCAR and bow ties. Everything keeps coming back to that word teacher. That's the noun head word, and everything's describing it. Lastly, we have adjectives and adverbs. Now, we can give you a definition of them. That's not always going to be very helpful. As we look at the form, we're going to find the forms are also sometimes a little tricky. Both adjectives and adverbs share similar form changes in similar signal words. For example, both can be signaled with qualifiers, which we're going to get into a little later, but words like very and quite and too, I can put them in front of adverbs and adjectives and they both would accept them. I can say very soon, very thick, quite carelessly, quite moldy, too often, too expensive. So that doesn't really help us figure out which one it is. They both have comparative forms, like adding the word er or more or less to it. So I could say sooner or thicker, more carelessly, more moldy, less often, less expensive. So that doesn't help us either. Superlative forms. This is adding an est or the word most or least, soonest, thickest, most carelessly, most moldy, least often, least expensive. Once again, all these both adjectives and adverbs seem to change the same way, and so we've got to figure out a way to kind of separate them. So I'm going to give you a couple tips on how to kind of maybe say, okay, how do I know if it's an adjective or an adverb? The first tool tip to put in your toolbox is that most ly words are adverbs. Quietly, carefully, slowly. That's helpful. Now, not all ly words are adverbs. Ugly, friendly, for example, those are adjectives. So it's helpful, but it's not 100%. Another tip for your tool belt is most adjectives can fit very neatly into these two slots. The blank noun is very blank. The angry leprechaun is very angry. Angry is an adjective. The weak coffee is very weak. Weak is an adjective. The ugly newborn is very ugly. Ugly is an adjective. But it doesn't always work. The dental hygienist is very dental. Makes no sense at all. Third tip, adverbs can move, adjectives cannot move. And that's true. But the meaning sometimes will change when you move an adverb, but you can typically pick up an adverb and move it. And once we get into what we call our grammar style, we're going to find that perhaps you could find some exceptions where you move the adjective after the noun to be stylish if you want to. And so it's not the greatest tip, but it's once again, the movability or the mobility of adverbs is sometimes helpful. The handiest advice I can give you is just to be rely on their questions. Adverbs answer 5 questions of how, when, where, why, and to what extent. And adjectives answer how much, how many, what kind, which one. And it's probably the best way of differentiating between those two. Let's pause our video.